All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're all about getting to the heart of complex issues really quickly and thoroughly. And today, we're going deep, really deep into globalization.
Globalization, huh?
Yeah, we've got a ton of articles and analyses on global trade, and we're going to try to figure out, has it really lived up to its promise? Has globalization actually benefited everyone, or has it left a lot of people behind?
Oh, that's a big question, for sure. Especially these days. Back when globalization was first taking off, like especially with the whole WTO thing, there was so much optimism. I mean, even President Clinton was all for it, right?
Yeah.
And back then, nobody really seriously questioned whether it was a good thing. Not in the mainstream, anyway.
Yeah, it really did feel like this kind of rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation.
Right.
But then you had things like the Seattle protests. Remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Back in '99, during that WTO meeting. Looking back, it's wild, right? Like, you had this totally bizarre mix of people protesting together, labor unions, environmental groups, even anarchists, all in the same streets. What was the common thread there?
Well, Seattle was a real sign of what was to come. I mean, the labor unions, they were worried about their jobs, right? American manufacturing jobs going to, sweatshops overseas, places with super low wages and zero worker protections. They wanted any new global trade deals to have, really strong labor standards built in,
Yeah.
to prevent that race to the bottom.
And the environmentalists were on a similar page, but from a different angle, right? They were worried about companies moving their production to countries with zero environmental regulations, creating basically pollution havens, right?
Exactly. So you had these two groups with different focuses, but they had this shared fear. This idea that without some sort of international safeguards, globalization could just turn into this race to the bottom, Countries constantly lowering their standards to attract business, hurting workers and the environment. And who benefits? The big corporations, right?
So what happened after Seattle? I mean, our sources show this massive expansion of global trade. And aside from the 2008 crisis, the world economy grew like crazy. Stock markets were up, corporate profits were through the roof, unemployment was super low. It looked like the globalists had won,
Yeah, if you looked at it from a purely economic growth perspective, it definitely seemed like they had a point. Free trade became the dominant ideology. Nobody was really questioning it anymore, not in the mainstream anyway.
And you could see how these ideas had seeped into politics, like in Canada, for example. In 1988, the Liberal Party was totally against the free trade agreement with the U.S. But then, fast forward to the Trump era, when NAFTA was on the chopping block, and suddenly the same Liberal Party under Trudeau is the biggest defender of NAFTA. They were even expanding trade deals with the EU and flirting with China. It was wild.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how deep those ideas about free trade had gotten. Even former opponents became huge supporters.
But those concerns from Seattle, they didn't just vanish, did they? Our sources suggest they came back later in some pretty unexpected ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you had the Occupy movement after the 2008 crash, right? They were focused on things like bank regulation, debt relief, and they were really against corporate greed.
Right.
It got a lot of attention for a while, even fueled some anti-establishment stuff in Europe, but they didn't really have a clear agenda or any strong leaders, and it kind of fizzled out.
And then you have this guy who seems like the opposite of a working class hero, Donald Trump, a billionaire with a gold-plated everything. And he managed to tap into that same anti-globalization sentiment we saw in Seattle. How did that happen?
It was pretty amazing, right? But it wasn't totally out of the blue. Back in '92, Ross Perot was already talking about NAFTA and how it would lead to this giant sucking sound of jobs moving to Mexico.
Oh, yeah?
That really hit a nerve with a lot of people. And then there's Jesse Ventura, remember him? Winning the governorship of Minnesota as this, our source calls him a hooligan, basically this outsider.
Right.
Trump saw how successful Ventura was and thought, hey, maybe that's a model.
Yeah.
He really played up the whole outsider image.
Yeah, he definitely did that. And after he won, a lot of people were saying it was all about these angry old white men who felt like globalization had screwed them over. But our sources point out this really interesting parallel. Trump and Bernie Sanders, two guys on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they agreed on a lot when it came to trade.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? How these two guys, Trump with his right-wing populism and Sanders with his democratic socialism, both ended up criticizing the global trade system and how it hurt American workers.
And they both went after those same voters, those working class voters. Sanders was especially tough on the Democratic establishment, hammering them on their trade policies during the primaries.
It was relentless. And it wasn't just an American thing either. You saw this same anti-globalization stuff popping up all over Europe.
Yeah, our sources mentioned the 2017 French election, where a ton of people voted for either Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-left guy. Both of them wanted France to leave the EU. Sound familiar? It's like the same arguments the Brexit guys were making in the UK, guys like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson.
Exactly. And the reason behind all those votes, whether it was left or right, was pretty much the same. Factory jobs disappearing, working-class people struggling. Even Mark Carney, the former Bank of England guy, a Canadian actually, he called stagnant wage growth a tragedy.
Strong words. And then you have Trump, this guy who came from the world of finance, right? And he basically went after the whole global trade system, harder than anyone else in his position had ever done.
Yeah, and he wasn't just talking, he actually followed through on a lot of it. Like in his inauguration speech, he made it very clear America was done with these globalist policies, and he wasn't kidding.
Which brings up the question, can these new trade rules, the ones they're talking about, like the Fair and Reciprocal Trade Act, did they really bring back those lost industries and jobs? It's interesting, right? When Trump started slapping tariffs on China, U.S. wage growth suddenly jumped up faster than it had in years.
Yeah, that's worth noting. I mean, if the old WTO rules were part of the reason American manufacturing declined, maybe these new policies, like this Fair and Reciprocal Trade Act, can turn things around.
To really understand this shift, we got to rewind a bit, right? Look at the bigger economic picture. Our sources talk about this post-World War II Keynesian consensus, where governments use things like interest rates and government spending to kind of manage the economy, smooth out the bumps.
Right. The Keynesian approach was all about government intervention, managing demand, stabilizing the economy. But then in the 70s, you had this stagflation thing. Inflation and unemployment both going up at the same time. It threw a wrench in the works.
And that led to monetarism, right?
Yeah.
Guys like Milton Friedman saying, hey, the government should just focus on controlling inflation, deregulate everything, let capital flow freely. This whole supply-side economics thing, which was the opposite of the Keynesian demand-side stuff.
Exactly. And one of the biggest results of globalization was how it changed how national income was distributed. Less money going to wages, more going to corporate profits.
Yeah. Our sources highlight this study by the Brookings Institution, saying that this decline in labor's share of the pie was mostly due to outsourcing, sending those labor-intensive jobs to places like China. So basically, the guys pushing for globalization in the 80s and 90s were right about wealth creation. But it wasn't shared very well, was it? Most of it went to a very small group of people.
Right. If you own stock, you were probably doing pretty well. And those super low interest rates we've had, those are directly tied to trying to control inflation, which is easier when you have all these cheap goods coming in from overseas.
Yeah. And those low rates, while they maybe helped soften the blow for some people, also contributed to this widening gap between the rich and everyone else.
Right. More money at the top, less in the middle. It changes everything, like what people are buying. You see luxury goods booming while the middle class is getting squeezed.
And you can see that in retail, right? High-end stores like Nordstrom doing great, while places like Sears, they're struggling. It's a reflection of what's happening to the middle class.
It really is. Now, the digital revolution, with all its tech advancements, that wouldn't have happened without these global supply chains. But it wasn't just tech that got impacted.
Like Harley-Davidson, right? Classic American company. Back in the 20s, Japan was a big market for them. Then the British slapped tariffs on them, so they had to find new markets. And now they're partnering with this Chinese company, Qianjiang, to make smaller, cheaper bikes for Asia.
And get this, Qianjiang makes way more bikes than Harley-Davidson does. It shows how much things have changed. They're selling more overseas, but it's costing them here at home. Sales in the U.S. are down. They closed their plant in Missouri. It's like a repeat of what happened in the 30s.
And then there are the tariffs that the U.S. imposed on, well, everyone, basically. And you have companies like Apple, Google, Dell. They're all moving production out of China.
It's a direct response to the trade war. Google moved their motherboard production to Taiwan. They're making their Nest stuff outside of China. HP is moving PC components to Southeast Asia. Apple's main assembler, Foxconn, is looking at moving out of China. Apple itself is thinking about shifting 30% of its production. Even Nintendo moved Switch production to Vietnam.
Wow. And it's not just electronics, right? Giant, the biggest bike maker in the world, they moved some production out of China too. They're supplying the U.S. from Taiwan now.
Interesting. But on the flip side, these tariffs actually helped the U.S. steel and aluminum industries. U.S. Steel's revenue tripled after the tariffs on steel imports.
And they're building new plants, right? Like Nucor in Florida. U.S. Steel even reopened a plant in Illinois, creating jobs. Same thing with aluminum. More production, more investment, more jobs. Companies like Century Aluminum, Magnitude 7 Metals, Alcoa, they're all restarting plants or making more aluminum.
It's a mixed bag for sure. To put all this into perspective, our sources take us back to the early days of the car industry in North America when cars were just starting to replace horses.
Yeah, there's this story about Canada's McLaughlin Motor Car Company and Buick. They teamed up because McLaughlin couldn't find good transmissions. They ended up merging, forming McLaughlin Buick, which became General Motors. And get this, Robert McLaughlin, the Canadian guy, he was totally against free trade with the U.S.
That's funny, right? He saw the dangers of letting American companies just come in and dominate. It's so different from today's car companies who are all about globalization. They don't want to bring those jobs back to North America.
Yeah, they even fought against stricter rules about how much of a car had to be made in North America during the NAFTA renegotiations. They said it was hard enough to meet the existing 62.5% rule. And that was before all the fancy electronics and touchscreens we have in cars today.
It shows how much globalization has changed things. It's not so simple to just go back.
Our sources also mentioned this funny story about Robert McLaughlin trying to make his own soda, Tona-Cola, to compete with Coca-Cola.
Oh, yeah. He was a real entrepreneur.
But it didn't work out. People preferred Coke. But then he had this other idea, Belfast-style ginger ale, which became Canada Dry. So there you go.
From cola to ginger ale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have NAFTA gone, replaced by this new thing, the USMCA, or CUSMA in Canada, MUSCA in Mexico. It all depends who you ask. Our sources make a couple of interesting points about this new deal. What are they?
Well, first, the name-changing thing is pretty weird, right? And then there's the fact that the word free is missing from the name of the U.S. and Mexico. Except when Trudeau and his trade negotiator, Chrystia Freeland, were talking about it, it's like everyone else knew this was a managed trade deal, not really free trade.
Which, as our sources point out, is kind of like that old Canada-U.S. auto pact, which actually broke WTO rules.
Yeah.
And it seems like Canada and Mexico weren't exactly jumping for joy to ditch NAFTA and sign this new thing.
Yeah, they didn't have much leverage against Trump, who was dead set on changing the game. They were definitely not happy campers.
And even with the USMCA and all the talk about bringing car jobs back to Ohio, General Motors closed plants in both the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah. The Lordstown closure was especially bad because the union had already agreed to wage cuts to save that plant, and then they closed the Detroit Hamtramck plant, too, their last one in Detroit, which used to be Motor City. Thousands of jobs lost on both sides of the border.
Now, the USMCA does have these new rules about Mexican wages. They have to pay at least $16 an hour for 45% of the work on a car by 2023. But the question is, will companies like GM or Magna actually quadruple wages in Mexico, or will they just pay the 2.5% tariff when they import cars?
That's the billion-dollar question, right? That 2.5% tariff might seem cheaper than raising wages, but then again, Trump had already threatened to use those national security tariffs, which are way higher. It's a gamble.
Some companies like Toyota are playing it safe, investing more in North America. And even GM was increasing investment. But the union went on strike, shutting down all their U.S. plants and even some in Mexico and Canada. They wanted guarantees about future production in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a tense situation. Nobody's quite sure what the future holds.
Moving on from trade deals, our sources talk about the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, in Canada, at the request of the U.S. What a mess that turned into.
It was a diplomatic nightmare. The U.S. wanted to extradite her for breaking sanctions on Iran, and China immediately arrested 2 Canadians. It was clearly retaliation. Relations between Canada and China went south fast. China stopped buying Canadian canola, and Chinese tourism to Canada plummeted.
And our sources point out the difference between the U.S. and Canadian legal systems, which are based on the rule of law, and China's system. And then there's Trump, saying he might use Meng as a bargaining chip in trade talks with China. That didn't exactly inspire confidence in the rule of law, did it?
Not really. And then you had Trudeau's own scandal with SNC-Lavalin, which also raised questions about political interference. It's a messy situation. Trade, geopolitics, and domestic law all tangled up.
Our sources describe China's transformation into this hyper-modern country. They've got amazing infrastructure, a powerful military, and they're doing cutting-edge science. It's incredible.
It's mind-blowing how fast they've developed. High-speed rail, advanced weapons, they're even making breakthroughs in quantum computing. Their influence is everywhere now, from building projects in Greenland to scientific research in Antarctica.
But it's not all smooth sailing, right?
Yeah.
Our sources mention the dangers of working on Chinese projects abroad, like those workers who were killed in Pakistan.
Yeah, that was a tragedy. It shows the risks that come with China's global expansion. They're making powerful enemies.
And there are concerns about China's debt trap diplomacy, where countries get stuck owing them huge amounts of money.
Yeah, like Fiji and Tonga, their debt to China is a huge chunk of their GDP. There are worries that China could use that debt to get military bases in those countries, like in Vanuatu. And then there's Tajikistan, which had to give up land to China because they couldn't pay their debts. It's a serious issue.
Back on the U.S.-Mexico border, our sources explain how changes in border policies actually led to fewer people crossing illegally, but more Central American families showing up asking for asylum. What's the difference?
Well, legally, there's a big difference between someone caught crossing the border and someone who shows up at a port of entry and asks for asylum. And these asylum seekers, especially families with kids, they presented a different kind of challenge for the U.S. immigration system.
And Trump used this to push his anti-immigration agenda. He declared a national emergency, cut aid to Central America, and threatened Mexico with tariffs if they didn't stop the migrants.
It's worth noting that this wasn't just a Trump thing. Obama also warned Central Americans about sending their kids to the U.S., and even Sanders was worried about open borders and their effect on wages.
Our sources then go back to 19th century Britain and the fight over the Corn Laws, which restricted grain imports. Why was that so important?
It was a key moment for free trade. These guys, Cobden and Wilson, they were big believers in Adam Smith's ideas, and they wanted to get rid of the Corn Laws. They said free trade would benefit everyone. The Economist is still making the same arguments today.
But our sources also point out that Wilson was a businessman who would profit from free trade. And Marx called the Economist a tool of the financial aristocracy. He said free trade would help capitalists, not workers.
Yeah, and in the end, the Corn Laws were repealed. It was a victory for the money guys over the old landowners.
Then we jump to the U.S. in the late 1800s and the populists fighting against the gold standard. William Jennings Bryan gave his famous Cross of Gold speech, which really resonated with farmers.
Farmers were struggling with deflation, low crop prices, and debt. But the bankers won that fight. They had more power, and the gold standard stayed. It's like today, some people say, where investors' interests are more important than workers' interests.
And the gold standard was tough on everyone, right? Workers had to accept lower wages, and farmers were at the mercy of global markets. It was brutal.
It definitely wasn't a system that prioritized people's well-being.
Now let's talk about George Soros. Our sources acknowledge his philanthropy, all the good work he's done, but they also talk about his role in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, where he made a ton of money by betting against currencies like the Malaysian ringgit.
It's a controversial legacy. Soros made huge profits, but the Malaysian economy crashed and people lost their jobs. It raises some serious ethical questions about how global finance works.
Yeah, it shows the power of big money in a globalized world. And then there are these zombie companies, businesses that are basically kept alive by cheap debt, thanks to central banks and low interest rates.
And who benefits from that? Shareholders, mostly. Companies focus on profits, not on investing in the future or paying their workers more. Our sources even point out that a bunch of big U.S. companies paid zero corporate tax. Some even got rebates. Amazon, Netflix, Chevron, Duke Energy, Eli Lilly, General Motors, Delta Airlines, Kinder Morgan, IBM, Honeywell, Molson Coors. The list goes on.
Wow. Lastly, our sources talk about this photo from a G20 summit, where it looked like the leaders of non-democratic countries were taking center stage.
Yeah, that was a symbolic image. You had Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump, Mohammed bin Salman all front and center, while Merkel and Trudeau were in the back. Putin even said liberal democracy was obsolete. It felt like a sign of things to come.
And it fits with the rise of populism and nationalism in Europe. The 2019 EU elections were basically a referendum on the future of the EU, and the right-wing populists did really well in France, Italy, Hungary, Greece. And then there's Boris Johnson and the Conservatives winning big in the UK, promising to get Brexit done.
It's a global trend. People are losing faith in the old systems. They're looking for something new, even if it's something radical.
And then COVID hit, and suddenly everyone realized how fragile our global supply chains are. Remember the ventilator shortage?
Yeah, the just-in-time system works great when things are normal, but it falls apart when there's a crisis. Switzerland, with their just-in-case stockpiles, they were much better prepared. They had reserves of everything. Food, fuel, medical supplies.
So what have we learned from this deep dive into globalization? Well, it's complicated. It's not all good or all bad. We've seen economic growth, but also rising inequality. We've seen populist backlashes, and we've seen how fragile our global systems can be.
It's a mixed bag for sure, and it's something we need to keep thinking about, keep discussing.
And as always, we're just trying to present the information from our sources, not take sides. It's up to you to decide what you think.
Exactly.
So here's a final thought for you. Given everything we've discussed today, how we balance global efficiency with local resilience? It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.